Well, good morning, everyone. Great to be here in Orlando and in Florida. Central bankers are professional worriers. I often get the question, what keeps you up at night? Believe me, one thing that does not worry me is the future of Florida. So it's great to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group of leaders in the very important state of Florida. Florida is a bellwether state in the national economy. It's the third most populous state, so consumer activity here contributes significantly to trends in consumer activity nationwide. Tourism, which is of course so important to this state, tells us a lot about the state of mind of domestic consumers and their propensity to spend. Residential real estate development in Florida is a signal of national and also international demand conditions and consumer confidence. I could go on, but the point is that Florida, with its diverse sub-economies and cultures, is an important window into the national economic picture. Trends, both positive and negative, and economic challenges in Florida have national relevance. Today, I plan to do three things in my remarks. I will interpret the decision of the FOMC, Doug mentioned the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, to leave policy unchanged at our most recent meeting on September 20th and 21st. I will offer my assessment of the current state of the national economy and the outlook. And I will discuss, very importantly, how human capital influences economic outcomes. Growth is a central issue of our times. Growth results from rising numbers in the workforce, enhancements of their tools, and improvement of their skills. At the national level, a central question today is, why is actual and potential growth restrained? Over the last several quarters, my FOMC colleagues and I have been progressively writing down our estimates of medium-term and long-term growth in our official quarterly forecasts. There are a number of contributing factors. An important one is low growth of labor productivity. So another question is, why does the trend of productivity growth continue to run low? In my remarks this morning, I'll provide my personal views on these questions, and I'll offer some thoughts on state and local workforce development efforts as a way to improve labor productivity. As always, all of my remarks will be personal views. I'm not speaking for the Federal Reserve or the Federal Open Market Committee. As I mentioned a moment ago, the FOMC left the policy interest rate, the so-called federal funds rate, unchanged at our last meeting. The policy rate target range is set 0.25% above a setting of what is effectively zero for all practical purposes. So the policy rate is almost as low as it can go. You may also be aware that on 3 occasions in recent years, the FOMC undertook bond buying programs in an effort to keep long maturity interest rates low. These programs swelled the central bank's balance sheet to around $4.5 trillion today. The FOMC is maintaining the status quo balance sheet as part of a quite accommodative stance of policy. In the statement that followed last week's meeting, the committee acknowledged that the national economy is improving and the case for a policy rate increase has strengthened. Nonetheless, the decision was to stand pat for the time being. That phrase, "for the time being," appeared in the statement for the first time, suggesting, at least as I see it, suggesting that a change in policy could occur before long. However, I did support the consensus view at the table that before taking the next move, it makes sense to see a little more evidence of progress toward our statutory policy objectives. Those statutory policy objectives are full employment and low and stable inflation. They are the North Stars of monetary policy. So decisions of the committee to adjust policy settings are highly influenced by our collective assessment of how far the economy is from the goals of full employment and a sustainable rate of inflation close to 2%. Think of full employment and 2% inflation as indications of an economy operating at steady state. When we've achieved those two objectives on a sustainable basis, policy should be set at neutral, neither intentionally stimulative nor intentionally restrictive. In my opinion, the national economy remains short of these two steady state conditions, but not by a lot. An evaluation of employment conditions should take into consideration a wide set of indicators, including conditions of various age cohorts and demographic groups. That said, the headline national unemployment rate, the one that you would be most familiar with, is a useful gauge. And unemployment in August stood at 4.9% on a national basis. This is within the range of last week's estimates by FOMC participants of the long-run sustainable unemployment rate. Likewise, there are a variety of ways to assess inflation. One that is preferred by the FOMC stood at 0.8% for the year through July. Headline inflation, as it's called, is influenced by volatile elements like the prices of gasoline and foodstuffs. If these categories of prices that are prone to ups and downs are excluded, then core inflation is the result, and core inflation over the last 12 months stands at 1.6%. Now think of these numbers relative to a 2% target. There is some difference of opinion among economists and among my colleagues whether or not the core inflation rate at 1.6%, that shortfall, is all that material. As a policymaker, I take both the current employment picture and recent inflation indicators as encouraging at the moment. I believe we're closing in on our objectives. We're nearing our objectives in spite of a relatively weak pace of growth. The economy expanded slowly in the first half of the year at a rate closer to 1%. The Atlanta Fed's estimate of growth in the third quarter, the quarter that will end tomorrow, is just about to end, is slightly below 3%. We believe that this pickup in the pace of growth will continue through the fourth quarter, such that growth for the year overall will likely end up just shy of 2%. A 2% annual rate of growth, or something close to 2%, has been the story of our economy's recovery since the recession ended in the summer of 2009. We've made substantial progress, particularly in employment, even with sluggish growth. The reality of a solidly performing labor market suggests that even at 2%, a relatively low rate of growth, the economy has been running above its long-run potential rate of growth. The thought here is that idle or underutilized resources, including labor resources, are absorbed into the economy when it operates for a period above steady state. Potential economic growth is limited by growth in the size of the labor force and how productive that labor force is. Let me repeat that in a slightly more complicated way. Population growth, adjusted for participation in the workforce, times productivity of labor yields economic growth. Both labor force participation and the rate of growth of labor productivity have been constraining potential for a number of years. Let me elaborate further on each of those two factors. The explanation for declining participation is multifaceted, but a significant portion of the decline is explained by demographics. Baby boomers are reaching retirement age, and although some are extending their working lives, their participation overall is falling. Florida, of course, is the beneficiary of this phenomenon from the perspective of population growth. There are other things affecting participation. For example, millennials staying in school longer, and in some cases, two-earner families reverting to one earner as the economy has improved. Recently, we've seen a slight uptick in participation nationally. And I attribute this to people who used to be out of the workforce rejoining the workforce, encouraged, at least in my view, encouraged by the continuing growth of jobs. Monthly payroll job growth has averaged 204,000 over the last year and 232,000 per month over the last 3 months. When I say 200, that's 204,000 a month over the last year, 232,000 over the last 3 months. I expect we will continue to see job growth comfortably above the number that's needed just to absorb population growth. So I expect we'll see either a further drop in the unemployment rate or a continuation for a while of the reversal of the participation trend. That said, my medium to long-term assumption is a persistent decline in participation. Demography is destiny, you might say. It would require an implausible rise in the labor force participation rate to fully offset the predictable retirement numbers of baby boomers. Let me now comment on low productivity growth, the second factor. I believe a good deal of the explanation of weak productivity growth relates to weak spending on capital equipment. Investment in structures, equipment, software, and other intellectual property products used by the labor force has been very soft since the early years following the end of the recession. When we at the Atlanta Fed ask business leaders across the Southeast about their reticence to invest more, we hear of a range of reasons. In Louisiana, for example, we hear about the severe cutback in drilling structures because of the fall of oil prices. This is just part of the picture, however. A broader sample of business people representing both small businesses and larger businesses tells us that businesses are cautious about predicting future demand in a low-growth economic environment. And very frequently, we hear references to greater perceived uncertainty, geopolitical, domestic politics, regulation, fiscal, and financial stability. In my latest forecast of economic performance through 2019, I assumed a modest pickup in capital spending just to sustain a 2% rate of growth over that time span. So importantly, I am not assuming an increase of capital deepening across the economy of a magnitude that would rapidly and meaningfully boost productivity. So again, let me repeat the simple equation from my introduction. Growth results from rising numbers participating in the workforce, enhancement of their tools, and improvement of their skills. With declining participation, even while the population is growing, but with declining participation and relatively weak investment in capital goods, the country has challenges achieving strong growth. So how do we respond? I believe workforce development programs have a place in the response to these challenges. Over the last year or so, my community and economic development team at the Atlanta Fed has sharpened its focus on workforce development systems and policies. And the Federal Reserve System overall has stepped up resources devoted to workforce development research and engagement of stakeholders. We believe workforce development represents fertile ground, and I'll point to 5 opportunities. First, the workforce development landscape is fragmented and could be better coordinated as an industry. Our community and economic development team engaged a group of 25 organizations across Metro Atlanta that are engaged in workforce development. And I'm using Atlanta here as a representative large city. The group found a lot of duplication of services and limited communication between and among organizations. There is much scope for greater collaboration. Second, too many providers of workforce development programs are not sufficiently aligned with employers. In a recent study of just over 200 providers, again in the Atlanta area, we found only 30% actually had a relationship with an employer. I'll note that Florida has taken an important step in broadening connections to the business community by rebranding all of its public workforce boards under the banner Career Source. This common brand has helped to make resources more available and understandable to businesses and job seekers. My third point, programs do not operate at large enough scale to meet the needs of employers and workers. We see potential to expand programs that have a demonstrated record of success. We're also of the view that states in the forefront of workforce development efforts would be well advised to leverage the power of existing resources such as community and technical college systems. Fourth, the funding situation of workforce development programs is complex. There's been a significant reliance on federal and philanthropic grant funding. There are a number of federal programs that fund workforce development, but they are in decline. Funding from state and local government is uneven. Funding challenges make good programs hard to scale. My colleagues believe that new financial models are needed to attract funding to workforce development programs, and we're working on this. Finally, improved data collection and dissemination will help direct resources to programs that are effective. We recently invited state labor data directors in the southeast region of the country to a meeting to discuss their data systems, what they thought was working and where they were seeking improvement. Representatives from CareerSource Florida, and the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity joined in the discussion. They pointed to improvement in this state's longitudinal data system. The intent is to evaluate the effectiveness of training programs for workers over the long run. We also heard about efforts to source local information across Florida on prevailing salaries in order to direct resources to programs that fill actual labor market gaps and deliver higher and more immediate returns on investment. These are all opportunities to bring workforce development efforts to bear on labor productivity and ultimately on the growth of potential and realized economic growth. An important state like Florida ought to be a leader in this movement. Let me close. We all want to see stronger growth. As a Fed policymaker, I would like to see growth modestly above potential for the immediate future in order to absorb whatever remaining slack exists in the labor market. But I would also like to improve potential. That is, I'd like to find ways to improve the longer run trend rate of growth. I believe doing so involves strategies that address fundamentals like our economy's endowment of human capital. So that concludes my formal remarks, and I thank you for your attention. And I'd like to open the floor for a few questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lockhart, Tony Carvajal with the Florida Chamber Foundation. We had some questions submitted. We have time for one question. I'll give you the choice.
One question.
Buy or sell is the first question, and we'd love to answer to that one. But the second one is, so Florida is in a race for global competition. Folks are wondering if it's worth comparing state versus state or not, but how is Florida doing relative to the rest of the region? And how is this region doing relative to the rest of the country? And how is this country doing relative to the rest of the world? Thank you.
Okay. Let me explain the region first, because we all live in defined territories in the Federal Reserve, and the 6th district of the Federal Reserve System encompasses all of the state of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, and parts of the states of Louisiana, Tennessee, and Mississippi. So that's an area of the country that's about 41 million people, 41 or 42 million people. It's about 13% of the GDP of the country. So the Southeast, as I've just defined it, is really quite an important part of the national economy. And I often get the question, how's the Southeast doing? And I think in terms of those 6 states. The Southeast overall, if I were to generalize, is lagging the national economy slightly. And I'm using indicators such as unemployment, growth rates, particularly employment is a good indicator. Florida, within that context, is doing better than the national economy. I looked at the numbers just yesterday from an employment point of view and from a growth point of view. Florida is exceeding the national numbers overall. So Florida, and of course Florida is a big part of that southeast region. Florida is really pulling the region along in some respects. We have other areas of the southeast that are not doing so well. An example of which I used in my remarks is Louisiana, a combination of the floods and the drop in oil prices. They're having a tough go of it at the moment. And we have other parts of the southeast that are simply not so strong. But Florida is doing its part. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us today.